Hello, everyone, and welcome to this last session of the day. It's been a long day especially for folks in other parts of the world. So we're very grateful that you're still tuning in. My name's Andrew Ross. I'm one of the organizers of Palestine Writes Festival, and I also serve in the organizing committee of US ACB, which is the American branch of the BDS movement, which is of some relevance to tonight's session. I hope you've been enjoying the sessions so far. It's a groundbreaking event. We've had more than 2,000 registrants for the festival so far, and we'll probably have a lot more as the days go on, and you can help by getting the word around, circulating tweets through the hashtag Palestine Writes. So this session is dedicated to artists and writers who combine the work of expression with the work of activism. And we have some of the best people in the business to talk about that this evening. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Jasbir Poor, who is a professor of women's and gender studies at Rutgers University. She's the author of award-winning books, including The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability, which is published in 2017, and also Terrorist Assemblages, Homo Nationalism in Queer Times, which was published in 2007 and reissued in an expanded version for its 10th anniversary in 2017. In 2019, she was awarded the Kessler Award from the Center for Gay and Lesbian Studies, which is given yearly to scholars and activists whose work has significantly impacted queer research and organizing. Jasbir.
Andrew, thanks for the introduction. Thanks to everyone for being here tonight. I also wanted to thank the organizers for the incredible work that they've done pulling together the event. And I've already been to a few panels and they've been just incredible. Looking forward to the next 4 days. As Andrew mentioned, I'm the moderator of this discussion. It has the title Organizing and Boycott in the Cultural Sphere. But we took this kind of to mean broadly various different kinds of Palestinian solidarity organizing. So our speakers tonight will be talking about US cultural and academic boycott campaigns, the increasing criminalization of Palestine solidarity activism and BDS organizing, ways of collectively resisting state, legal, institutional, and corporate repression. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, thinking through decolonizing and revolutionary modes of enacting solidarity. So when I think about these issues, I am reminded, first of all, of Angela Davis, beseeching us to make our movement work intersectional. And second of all, a saying from Decolonize This Place, BDS is the floor, not the ceiling. This statement for me so clearly indicates that the BDS movement is not an ends unto itself, but a generative opening and one that can lead to and intersect with a multitude of radical movements. So the evening is going to go like this. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Unfortunately, Natasha Dillon is unexpectedly in transit and couldn't make it this evening. Natasha and Amin are two members of Decolonize This Place. So each of our speakers will talk for about 15-20 minutes. We'll address some questions to each other afterwards, and then we'll open up for audience questions. Although I think the chat is open, if you could please use the Q&A section to enter your questions, it would be really helpful because we can't necessarily keep track of questions in the chat. So to begin with, we have J.K. Lani Kalanui. She's a professor of American Studies and affiliate faculty in anthropology at Wesleyan University. She's the author of Hawaiian Blood, Colonialism and the Politics of Sovereignty and Indigeneity. This was in 2008. And most recently, Paradox of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism from 2018. She's also the editor of Speaking of Indigenous Politics, Conversations with Activist Scholars and Tribal Leaders that's 2018 as well, which is based on the radio program that she produced and hosted for 7 years that was widely syndicated through the Pacific Network. She's currently completing a new book, which I think we're going to hear about a bit today, Indigenous Implications, Decolonizing Palestine Solidarity Activism. Kawanui is one of the 6 co-founders of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, otherwise known as NISA. And since its inception, she has served as an advisory board member of the US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, US ACBI. So I'm also an advisory board member. So ACBI is well represented, US ACBI is well represented tonight. I'm going to introduce Natasha, even though she can't be here, because I believe there's a video that she had sent over to be included, which I'm really happy about. Natasha Dillon has a BA in mathematics from St. Stephen's College at the University of Delhi, and a PhD from the Department of Media Study, University of Buffalo. She also attended the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York and the School of International, the International School of Photography. Elaine has a BA in Philosophy and Political Science, a JD from Indiana University School of Law, and an LLM from Columbia Law School. Amin practiced law for 5 years before transitioning to art, studying at the School of the International Center of Photography and the Whitney Independent Study Program. So together, Amin and Natasha are the MTL Collective, a collaboration that joins research, aesthetics, organizing, and action in its art practice. MTL is a founder of a number of other projects. So Tidal, Occupy Theory, Direct Action Front for Palestine, Global Ultra Luxury Faction, and most recently, MTL, the collective that's facilitating Decolonize This Place. So currently MTL is in post-production of an experimental feature film, which is called Unsettling, and it's coming at the end of the year, which is very soon. And Andrew and I are actually part of that film project, so I'm really excited to see that. So Kaylani, we'll open with you, and then Amin, you can jump in after Kaylani is finished.
Thank you so much. Aloha and greetings, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Jasbir. I appreciate being invited to speak here at this incredible festival and have already been taking in the offerings, having attended 2 panels earlier. Thanks to all the organizers. It is a privilege to be here and to join you, and thanks for those of you who are tuned in to attend. It's incredible to see how many Palestinian participants there are in the program, and also the global participant list in terms of those who registered. Just to ask my colleagues here, can you hear me all right? Okay. Before I dive in, I want to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the traditional homeland of the Wangunk people in what is known as Middletown. The indigenous place name here is Mattabesset in Connecticut. My starting this way is not some empty liberal gesture for which land acknowledgements have come to be criticized. Rather, this is protocol taught to me by my Native Hawaiian elders. I understand land acknowledgements are getting a bad rap these days. However, in my immediate context, the name of the people whose land I dwell on is not common knowledge, let alone the fact that the Wangunk people are alive and thriving today, albeit not as a polity. And part of the reason this is not common knowledge is that the official state doctrine still claims that they are extinct. In any case, while many rightly point out that land acknowledgements are not worth much when compared to actual land return, #landback, here I insist that knowing whose land one occupies is a prerequisite to redress and restitution. And in New England, the Northeast here, and arguably most of the United States, with some regional exceptions, that is also not a given. My activist experience with boycott politics is grounded in my work as an advisory board member of the US Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, USACB. Here today, speaking to the cultural sphere, I want to talk about this work and the backlash against Palestine solidarity work, in particular, in relation to the fraught political culture in the United States, with a focus on normalization of settler colonial violence and Zionisms, both Jewish and Christian. As a Kanaka Maoli, that is Indigenous Hawaiian woman, I come at the question of Palestine self-determination through my BDS activism, BDS as in boycott, divestment, sanctions, and also as a scholar of settler colonial studies and Indigenous studies, as well as from an anarchist political orientation. I have served on the advisory board for the US Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, USACB, since it was founded in the midst of Operation Cast Lead in 2008. Besides working closely with Students for Justice in Palestine at Wesleyan University, I have also engaged with other chapters on campuses across the country. And to different degrees in each case, I have been active or was active in mobilizing for academic boycott within the American Studies Association, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, as well as the American Anthropological Association. I should also mention, because I'll be talking a bit about the broader legal challenges, I'm currently a named defendant in a lawsuit related to academic boycott filed by the Brandeis Center. That name of the lawsuit is Bronner et al. V. Dugan et al., named after Simon Bronner, the lead plaintiff in the case, and Lisa Dugan, the first individual named defendant. And that lawsuit is currently before the DC Superior Court, and it's one of two lawsuits that targeted us, and I can say more about that. Until June of this year, I was also a named defendant in a second lawsuit by the same name, which was before the federal court in the District of Columbia. And I can say more about both cases a little later. For those of you unfamiliar with USACB, and for those of you who may not know, because I've been informed that we do have a global audience and not to assume that prior knowledge, for those of you who are unfamiliar with USACB and the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement in general, BDS, this is something that was launched by Palestinian civil society, comprised of over 170 unions, political parties, refugee networks, women's organizations, professional associations, popular resistance committees, and other non-governmental bodies. And that campaign was launched in 2005. And as outlined by the BDS National Committee, which is based in the West Bank, the call urges nonviolent pressure on Israel until it complies with international law by meeting three main demands. The first is ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. The second is recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And the third is respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in United Nations Resolution 194. Some activists have criticized BDS as a liberal project rather than something more left-leaning or even radical, without acknowledging that it was designed to be exactly that, a liberal project. This is a given since it is a rights-based campaign and one that is grounded in normative international law. As scholar activist David Lloyd, who is co-founder of USACB, as he puts it, quote, "The BDS movement demands that Israel actually become what it pretends to be, a normal democracy and a state of all its people. The movement is all-inclusive and based on principles of equality." Lloyd continues regarding what BDS is and can enable by stating this in his article titled "The Nightmare Hidden Within Liberal Zionism." Quote, "It is an invitation to free oneself from the painful contradiction of advocating democracy and defending and supporting oppression. It is an invitation to step out of the meshes of a Zionist dream that has become a nightmare, ever more rigid and repressive, and to embrace the possibilities and the risks that true democracy and ethical decolonization entail, end quote. Here, his point regarding the contradictions embedded in Zionism as a supremacist ideology authorizing settler colonial violence while portrayed as something liberatory, that is Israeli exceptionalism, is something I want to highlight since it resembles American exceptionalism. We can see this in the persistent ideology of manifest destiny that is still entrenched in US society and undergirds the legal system in the United States with regard to all indigenous peoples, including those in the island colonies, as well as the continent. And here I want to briefly discuss how I'm extending the invitation of the BDS movement to the US context with regard to what Lloyd describes as ethical decolonization, which I argue necessarily means a critical look at the concept and practice of self-determination. As Jasbir mentioned in the introduction before I came on, I am currently working on a book manuscript titled Indigenous Implications, Decolonizing US-Palestine Solidarity Activism. The project is an intervention in how US-based solidarity activists engaged in the BDS movement situate Palestine and the ethics of challenging the settler colonial state of Israel when they themselves, or we ourselves, are located in another, the United States. Showing the limits of both occupation and apartheid as legal and analytical frameworks, I argue that settler colonialism is a more precise model for understanding and reckoning with Israel's domination of historic Palestine and the Palestinian people, given that land expropriation is the centerpiece of the Zionist political project. The book then shows the implications of the settler colonial frame, which necessitates challenging activist discourses of exceptionalism regarding the Israel-Palestine case. While many in the BDS movement rightly criticize US imperialism, especially in the Middle East, fewer challenge US settler colonialism, as though the struggles of indigenous peoples here are resolved and can be relegated to the past. In other words, it is common that people see the process of settler colonialism in the US as already largely completed, while in contrast to understanding it as ongoing in Palestine. My study especially builds on the path-breaking work of Stephen Salaita in his text, Inter/Nationalism, Decolonizing Native America and Palestine. There he lays out the processes by which Palestine has become a topic of interest in the field of Native American studies, and also explores the implication of incorporating Palestine into the field. Salaita also engages the US-based BDS movement, noting its important potential as an organizing project, as well as in cultivating intellectual and political communities that put indigenous peoples and Palestinians into conversation. He lays the conceptual ground between Native American studies and Palestinian studies through the concepts of settler colonialism, indigeneity, and state violence. In turn, he also argues that Native American studies should be more central to the scholarship and activism focused on Palestine. My project extends his call by offering a sustained look linking challenges to Israeli settler colonialism while also interrogating US settler colonialism vis-a-vis indigenous peoples. That is, to expand the politics of ethical decolonization and anti-normalization. With a focus on the contemporary period and critically examining both international law and US federal policy, Indigenous Implications, that's the provisional title of the book, argues for a more ethically consistent approach for activists engaged in solidarity campaigns while based on indigenous lands claimed by the United States here at home. Thus, by Indigenous Implications, the title of the manuscript is also a reminder that activists based in the US, we are all implicated in the politics of indigeneity given the settler colonial context. Moving beyond the solidarity as expressed through BDS campaigns, then, I advocate for a politics of decolonization in reframing and rethinking solidarity politics by addressing the connections to indigeneity here in the context of US settler colonial violence. Now I'm reading a little bit on the slow side only because I know there are people interpreting this and I want to thank the interpreters. Now to discuss briefly the politics of the lawsuit I made earlier, because I see that as a signal and to flag the levels of normalization of Zionism in the United States. I think one of the major advances that the BDS movement in the US has made is to break the link between criticism of Israel and accusations of anti-Semitism. I alone can see that shift in how it's developed just looking at the last decade. I think this is important context for understanding the US federal adoption through the US State Department and other governmental agencies of the definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA. This is a doubling down to insist on the conflation and to criminalize or otherwise penalize Palestinians and those in solidarity with the Palestinian people in terms of how that definition has been applied, interpreted, and deployed throughout several countries in Europe and also in Canada and the United States. And I think much of the timing of this has to do with different organizations and networks having gotten closer to being able to talk openly about the core issue, the political ideologies of both Jewish and Christian Zionism. In other words, the proliferation of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism not only diverts the necessary struggle against anti-Semitism while discrediting the Palestinian struggle, it attempts to derail us from interrogating Zionism itself. In 2016, 4 white American male academics, Simon Bronner mentioned earlier, Michael Rockland, Michael Barton, and Charles Kupfer filed a lawsuit against the American Studies Association, the ASA. Along with the ASA, they are suing me, Jezbir Puar, Stephen Salaita, Lisa Dugan mentioned earlier, Sunaina Myra, Curtis Merez, Neferti Tadiar, Chandan Reddy, and John Stevens, along with the ASA Association, that is the ASA itself, regarding a resolution for the academic boycott of Israel, which passed by a vote undertaken by the entire ASA membership was eligible to vote. And that vote took place in December 2013. The case, again, Bronner et al. V. Dugan et al., and of course the et al. Means and others. That case is backed by the Louis D. Brandeis Center, an Israel advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., which has a long history of smearing Palestine solidarity activism by branding it as anti-Semitic. The center's efforts to harass and punish Palestinians and Palestine solidarity activists include this waging of frivolous lawsuits. They have accused us of engaging in what they term, quote, an illegal, hostile takeover of a nonprofit academic association through a series of misrepresentations and breaches of duty, end quote. And I should also note that even in their official documents for the lawsuit, they themselves have actually employed anti-Semitic language by calling us a secret cabal. And I don't think irony even comes close to touching upon what that is in terms of their use of that term, but you get the idea, I hope. Also, I should note that the Brandeis Center, for those of you who may be unaware, was founded by Kenneth Marcus, who was Trump's appointee to head the Civil Rights Office within the US Department of Education. And he resigned a few months ago. You know how the saying goes, said he wanted to spend more time with his family. I'd love to know what that's really about, but I can't say it's a moot point because you know, Biden is not beyond appointing somebody like Kenneth Marcus in that position either, which is something we might want to talk about in terms of the cultural sphere or the culture of US politics and the changing of the guard here. anyhow, back to the lawsuit, the plaintiffs allege, in terms of this series of misrepresentations and this hostile takeover, allege that, quote, certain individual defendants continued to collaborate with US ACB leadership and continued to keep secret their collaboration with US ACB, end quote. And this is really important because if you look at the individual named defendants of the case that I mentioned, all but just a couple are held at least some official position within the ASA governing structure at one point or another, whether it was on council or in some other form, like being on the program committee and so forth, and also having that overlap of being active with US ACB. The ones that do not overlap or hold both of those, if we're looking at the Venn diagram here, is John Stevens, who's the executive director of the association. So he is sued because of his post, right? He's named as an individual, but it's not necessarily about him as an individual. It's that he's carrying out the work of the elected body of leaders. And the other people that are not, at that time, were not part of US ACB that are also being sued include select council members, and that would include Lisa Dugan, Chandan Reddy, and Curtis Merez. And Lisa Dugan, Curtis Merez were the two presidents that overlapped at the time of this case. And obviously it's still going on, so there are other presidents, but meaning that they were implicated in terms of the plaintiff's claims. So just to explain kind of who the named defendants are. But that doesn't mean that any of it adds up, right? The resolution was passed long before, say, Stephen Salaito was elected to council, or Jasbir, who's on our call right now, was part of a nominating committee years before the resolution was even, a twinkle in the eye of those of us who are part of the US ACB delegation that sort of brought it into being with a huge group effort from its original sort of origin story. So the reason I'm mentioning that is plaintiffs are alleging this link to keep the collaboration with US ACB secret. And part of what I want to highlight here is that what I see as the real target of this particular lawsuit, beyond the kind of classic sort of punishment techniques, is that US ACB is really the target, right? And it's interesting that they've noticed too that they're suing individual named defendants, but also suing the ASA, saying that the individual named defendants enacted some breach of duty vis-a-vis the ASA. And I think, really, then why isn't the ASA suing me? Why is the ASA a defendant? If people actually betrayed or violated their trust with the ASA, why isn't the association, suing us? Why are they in the defendant seat? But I think really this is about US ACB. This is about intelligence and data collection through the discovery process, because plaintiffs keep adding names to the lawsuit, and then they get literally thousands, or in some cases tens of thousands of emails. And this gives them an inside look at correspondence among those working with US ACB. And if we think about when the lawsuit was filed, first, the federal lawsuit, that is, in 2016, in early 2016, you still had a lot of this work emanating from US ACB vis-a-vis academic institutions. I mean, US ACB is doing a lot of different kinds of work, but I mention this with regard to the associations because, you had efforts within the Middle East Studies Association, the American Anthropological Association, the MLA, the Asian American, the Association of Asian American Studies, and so forth. You have US ACB being a hub for that, and a lot of other kinds of activist work in both academic and cultural boycott. Just to clarify, to go back to the fact that there were two lawsuits and now there's one. Again, that first lawsuit was the federal case, which was filed in 2016. And by February 2019, the judge in the case, Judge Contreras, threw out the federal case and dismissed it, but dismissed it without prejudice. And that left the door open for the plaintiffs to appeal. The Court of Appeals decision focused primarily on the technical aspects of Contreras's decision, that the plaintiffs themselves had no way to legitimately claim that they met the jurisdictional limit of 75,000 US dollars in damages, right? Because at the federal level, each individual plaintiff has to show that they were damaged to that extent, and they couldn't meet that threshold. So I note that not to get you mired in the minutia of the case, but just to say that the judge did not get into any discussion that was politically substantive, and there was no analysis of the right to boycott at all in that decision. So that was the appeal. When in February 2019, when the judge threw that case out, the plaintiffs filed their appeal in that case within weeks, and really right at the same time also filed a second lawsuit. And that was just a few weeks later. And that second lawsuit was filed in the DC Superior Court. And part of it is that they don't have to meet that $75,000 threshold in terms of the jurisdictional limit of what the federal court is willing to even look at or adjudicate. Now, by June 2020, so just a few months ago this year, that federal case was dismissed with prejudice. So the only way that could get traction is if it goes, to the Supreme Court. But the second case, the one in the DC Superior Court, is still live and very active. And unfortunately, the details of that case are sealed by court order at the request of the plaintiffs. So I'm not allowed to say anything more about that case, but it does beg the question of why is this case secret at all? And why is it that I'm not able to talk about it, just to inform people about the claims or the counts, as they say. We wouldn't say charges because it is a civil suit. And I want to mention that too, because we can talk about the criminalization of BDS and the legal backlash, as well as the social sort of pushback and social backlash that isn't in the legal realm. And that's the tricky thing about these suits. They're not criminal suits, they're civil suits, but they still have the function of criminalizing through slander, right? And defamation, but also a sort of a punishing part in terms of the criminalization through innuendo, and often that is dealt with through the media. So the ASA lawsuit or lawsuits are part of a string of withering and slanderous personal attacks on faculty members on US campuses. These attacks also hit students very hard, and these are first and foremost affecting Palestinians, along with other Arabs, and then those in solidarity with Palestinians. And the lawsuits filed are just too numerous to even mention here, but I do want to especially acknowledge the many lawsuits that have targeted esteemed senior colleague Rabab Abdul Hadi, as well as even at San Francisco State University, I should mention, where the administration did not have her back in that at all. And also you've got cases dealing with Fordham University and Northeastern University and so forth, just on the very right to even have a Students for Justice in Palestine group be allowed to exist on campus and so forth. Those who go after supporters of BDS are political bullies engaged in a despicable form of what some have called neo-McCarthyism, as well as just good old-fashioned dishonesty. And they attempt to marginalize those of us making any principled criticism of Israel. These people and their shameless attacks and pressure campaigns are what we must collectively condemn, rather than those who stand for the freedom and dignity of the Palestinian people. These are malicious lawsuits provoked by politically motivated individuals that intend to inflict punishment on colleagues who criticize the state of Israel and its policies. The ASA, again, just one of many, has no basis in fact, no basis in law. As plaintiffs and the organizations backing them admit, and even, not surprisingly, brag, the point of these legal proceedings is to punish those of us who stand in solidarity by engaging in what they like to call as lawfare. and it's protracted. And so the idea, I've had friends, colleagues, family say, don't worry about it. It's all going to be okay in the end. Everything's going to be fine in the end. And I'm like, well, number one, I'm not worried about me as an individual. This is part of a broader political wave across the country. But, what I always point out in talking actually about the lawsuit is I'm not worried about, I'm not trying to tempt the gods here, but I'm not worried about the outcome. The point of the lawsuit isn't the outcome of the lawsuit. The point of the lawsuit is the lawsuit, right? To keep us in this protracted lawfare, to try and exhaust our resources, human and material. The backlash has its own implications in the world of the academy, the US Academy, and beyond. This is happening beyond the US, of course, and also has implications for the cultural workers and cultural production. This can include disciplinary actions on campuses, just speaking to the academic context for a minute, harassment, firings, baseless legal complaints, and false accusations of anti-Semitism by administration, staff, students, and other faculty. Palestine Legal responded to 247 incidents of suppression on US-based Palestine advocacy just in 2019. We'll see what the numbers are for 2020. But they keep going up every year, unsurprisingly. And again, I don't think that we have any reason to think that these numbers would go down under the Biden administration, far from it. But we see just how incredibly strong the effort to silence has become and continues to grow. Zionists use lawfare to obfuscate the actual point, standing in solidarity with an oppressed people struggling under settler colonial rule. Nowhere do any of those using the weapon of law mention anything about the Palestinian people. I should mention too, if you look at the list of words for the filing for discovery and for the first round of individual plaintiffs, you've got 30 pages of just keywords. So any email that has those keywords, you're expected to turn over to the attorneys of the plaintiffs. But they don't use the word Palestine, That's how deep that erasure goes for them. They don't even use the P word, right? They don't use the word Palestine. Everything's about Israel. So again, not only are they not mentioning the actual people of Palestine, they're not even mentioning the word. So lawfare, again, is meant to punish those who stand in solidarity and also to render that connection, and that is that form of internationalism, to erase that as it is part of the broader erasure of the existence of the Palestinian people. In other words, the criminalization of civil issues is connected to the criminalization of being Palestinian. And in closing, this should go without saying, I stand in solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian people as someone who contests, protests, and resists settler colonialism, occupation, and apartheid wherever it takes hold, including here. Mahalo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just a few opening remarks, and then I have a set of images to guide the conversation. Jasbir again mentioned that Natasha Dillon couldn't be with us. She had to take her grandmother to Punjab, who's elderly. It was unexpected. And in any event, she left us a video. Just to contextualize the video that I'll play, it's 1 minute long. It was recorded in the airport after the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, took her for interrogation and had access to her phone. And then she went on her airplane, barely making it. So that's kind of the context for the video I'll show. This set of images that I'm going to share is really kind of a collective organizing that's been happening in New York City, but also in other places. It's a product of many groups and many people working hard who have a deep a deep love, revolutionary love for Palestine, but in other words, a love to get free. And in that sense, you know, decolonization and abolition are at the core of that work. It doesn't really function within the nation state. And so it thinks about internationalism as a way and enacting collective liberation, what that looks like from a day-to-day practice. So the other thing that I want to kind of point out from the onset is that this kind of work blurs the line between academic pursuits and activism and art. It's meant to kind of ask the broader questions of how do we get free and how do we live now and how do we imagine and love and support one another, not as an end result, but as a daily practice from the ground up. And, you know, to some degree, this is a history that has been referred to throughout the day in terms of the poets who were critical to the Palestinian liberation struggle, or the novelists who, like Ghassan Kanafani, were both writers and thinkers and actors. And so there isn't this separation. This is not new, but it is something that we're lacking nowadays. And it's something that we're reviving as we're thinking about it. The final point I'm going to make is that before I share my screen, is that I'm going to try to speak slowly, and thank you to the organizers of this event, and thank you for the interpreters. الفن والثقافة في طريق التحرر. And just kind of a point, the word decolonization doesn't really have a counterpoint in Arabic. So taharrur, liberation, is the closest to that. So art and culture on the path of liberation. I'm going to read this in Arabic just because it's really important for people to understand kind of the framework in the Arabic context. تجارب حركتنا في الفن والنضال قادتنا بعيدا عن إطار العمل في العدالة الاجتماعية إلى التحرر النظري والفعلي من الكولونيالية. حرر هذا المكان تطمس الخطوط الفاصلة بين الفن والنشاط والتنظيم، وهي نتيجة سنوات من العمل في طيف واسع من النضالات، من حركة احتلال في أمريكا Occupy Wall Street إلى حياة السود مهمة Black Lives Matter إلى Standing Rock إلى الحرية لفلسطين. This is the video. In a way, it's the apology, but the context that anchors this entire talk, which is thinking, it really kind of echoes what was just said. There is a problem in exceptualizing Palestine, and there's a distinction we need to make between specificities of struggle and to struggle where we are, versus this idea of like, look how much they are harming us. How can anyone accept this? And this is kind of something that Natasha speaks to.
I'm really sorry to miss this panel today. I was really excited about the conversation. I'm actually headed to Punjab right now with my grandmother, and I couldn't really change my travel plans, so I'm really sorry. I just wanted to say that Palestine has been very important for me to understand struggles, not just in relation to Palestine and the United States, but also places like Punjab and Kashmir, where we're seeing the technology of the Israeli occupation being exported and used by nation states like India and Mexico. So in some ways, one of the biggest, organizing challenges for us is how do we really think about anti-imperial struggles in the context of empire when, movements like Black Lives and indigenous struggle are really important and core to here. How do we add these other movements to it and move beyond single issue organizing? So I just want to say I have massive solidarity for the Palestinian struggle, and I hope you all have a good conversation.
So moving beyond issue silo organizing. Now, Natasha had talked about, she's going back to Punjab where there's a land grab. Earlier last year, there was Kashmir, where similarly an occupation still continues by India. and now the taking of land in Punjab from the farmers. This is again by something that people would call post-colonial nation state. And so really kind of thinking more about that throughout this work. But this is an image where last summer we went to Mexico, and we met again as a solidarity group, just kind of exchanging information and knowledges. And this is with the Ayotzinapa movement, 41 students who went missing, and with their parents and the organizers there, and also understanding what's happening with the Maya train, where they're again in the name of progress taking land from indigenous people in Mexico. And this is by what would some call a progressive or liberal government. But to see the visuality of this is to see art, movement generated art, revolutionary art, that isn't so much about representation, but facilitating a space for thinking and imagining and breathing. And the fact that there was a flag there of Palestine is an indication of how much love there is. And part of the thing is the separation that gets created in all sorts of ways, and what we tend to reinforce when we say that Palestine is different. The counterpoint, or let's say the other version of this, is where you have leftists say, well, Palestine is different, everything but Palestine. But there's a point in the way we're organizing right now, and this is kind of, we can have a lot of conversations and open to questions about just a case study of what we have done as an analytical framework with Decolonize This Place over the course of 4 years, based on a set of failures and lessons learned since 2011. Many people traveled from very far, from villages, to come to this conversation here. And you can see the people. I guess I'm sharing this for one other reason, which is look at who's in the audience, right? These are not so much academics or or organizers. They're a family, they're a community, they're coming together, they are resisting, they are learning, and they were interested in learning about Palestine. And they were interested in the points of contact between the connections and what we can build together. And this is something that I say for the Palestinians on this talk, but also for people that are doing Palestine solidarity work. You cannot forget the other struggles around class. Just because Palestinians are Palestinians doesn't mean that there isn't oppressors within Palestinians. And if we're thinking about collective liberation, we have to understand what is the politics that we're upholding. So in the context of BDS, that's why we say BDS is the floor, not the ceiling, not to exclude it, but a rights-based approach by itself is not what's going to give us the thing that doesn't exist and perhaps has never existed for us in terms of what freedom looks like. This is kind of the analytical framework that we use in Decolonize This Place, and we can attribute it, one way to look at this is how we think about decolonial solidarity. And decolonial solidarity becomes critical to how we move in the world. And this kind of map or flowchart is really comes from a paragraph in Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Kay Yang. But the important point here is that this is in the context of the United States specifically. And they take the land, they genocide a people and render them invisible. They create a nation state, and then it functions, the United States functions like an empire. They're not mutually exclusive. But in the context of taking away the land here in the United States is that they had to, enslave people from other places to do the labor, quote unquote, for free. Now, as a Palestinian who lives in the United States and is residing as a guest or as a settler on occupied Lenape, unceded territory, I can't talk about Palestine without talking about this occupation. So then how can I think about those things together and not be overwhelmed, but in fact think strategically about how we can build people power that imagines a different set of relations that ushers in the world that can, where many worlds can reside in. So just to kind of, you know, so you can think of the issue silos as not issue silos at all. You know, you can think of what's happening here in terms of, now you can flip this chart and you can have enslavement begin instead of indigenous people as seized land, but that's just the positionality that you hold and how you enter the struggle. And this is not mutual, this is not exclusive, and this is just, you know, a way to think about it. But one thing about the United States, similar to Palestine, is that what is going on there isn't something that happened in 48 or something that happened in 67 or something that happened during Oslo or something that happened after the second uprising or the third. It's ongoing. It doesn't stop until we are gone. And it's important to think that way and to understand that, so that you can be able to both resist, live, build, love, care, all these kind of things that are important. So internal colonialism that occurs in terms of gentrification, which is displacement and dispossession, or military recruitment, in which you have, you know, Black folks, you know, dropping bombs on Vietnam, or, you know, or you can have, you know, the low wages kind of struggle. You can have the displacement, the migration, the wars abroad that bring people over here, like the South Asian community, right? All of these things are things that we have to consider and that we've been thinking about with Decolonize This Place. But this is kind of how the analytical framework that we carry with us in working out of New York City. So these are two posters that then kind of try to distill as opposed to simplify. And one of the things that, and this is just our strategic approach, that decolonization is not a metaphor. I think you get that with the idea of land back. That's not a metaphor. And the triangulation of indigenous struggle, Black liberation, and a free Palestine produce a rearrangement of relationships that can upend empire. And you have a poster that looks like that. And then you have the Black Lives Matter, which materialized in the real world, and with the kufiya on the side. And then you have the poster of thinking of this coalition in the sense of Fred Moten would talk about it, right? Of the people that want to get free, not a set of organizations, not in a bunch of NGOs that are funded by the Ford Foundation. We're talking about people that want to get free and recognize that they are not free unless we are all free. This is, you know, just what it says. And it's like under the museum, under the university, under the city, the land. And I think that this recognition and visualizing it and having people come together, right, to resist the state, but also reclaim space and hold space for each other, is both pedagogical. It's both how we kind of heal. How do we connect colonial wounds? Now, MTL, like I said, like was kind of suggested in the introduction, began with me and Natasha, but we were involved in many different groups and movements, beginning with Occupy Wall Street, which centered class at the expense of the recognition that we're already on stolen land, and we didn't center racial justice. So thinking about the failures of our movements, or thinking of these movements as ruptures in time that help us learn for a movement yet to come that is mature in how we think and move and act together. So from Direct Action Front for Palestine in 2014, where we thought how direct action can be a way to uplift these struggles, to Decolonial Cultural Front, which led to Decolonize This Place, to Strike Debt, which is thinking about debt as not a negative commons, meaning the idea of like, can we really be free if we all have debts to banks where we promise future labor and still talk about freedom? And then how can these financial debts, we reject them and recognize the debts that we owe each other? All of these had successes and failures that led to decolonize this place. But in 2011 and 2012 and 2013, we were already recognizing how a lot of the movements in the United States don't really take an anti-imperial stance. They're very US centric. So we thought of the colonizer as lender and tried to connect Free Palestine with Occupy Wall Street and Strike Debt, both three different movements that were going on at the same time, and thinking about that. Now, what's interesting once you start thinking about debt is that if you look at the post-Oslo period, you know, and Andrew can speak to this, how many Palestinian households have financial debt, that they take micro lending out, that they take money out to get married, money out to buy a TV, money out to, you know, furnish an apartment. These are things in which then Palestinians are not free to resist. Similar to the fact that we have to work in Israel. Once they take the land, then you have to sell your labor, and you sell your labor to the people that pay more, and then you end up building the wall, working in the settlements, working in Israel, and you're very concerned about losing your job. So the ability for you to resist is diminished. This is something that we did in 2014. Again, thinking about boycott, divestment, and sanction, but thinking about how you can hack iconic symbolism and send a message of solidarity to the world. And there's ways in which we got around this in connection to the police that was really important. This is another example of something that we did here. In essence, it comes from the poster came after this, but we made 11 banners that said Black Lives Matter for every time Eric Garner said I couldn't breathe, with the kufiya just on one side. And then the 12th banner that read, when we breathe together. But the point of these banners were not just to create images and to show solidarity. They were so that they can shut down intersections, and so that they, you know, other things can be done with these banners. Now, again, the point with these, the point that we learned with working in Direct Action Front for Palestine in 2014, that people, when they act and they, in a moment of rupture, it usually lasts 2 or 3 months. There are many issues people are struggling with. So then if your analysis can be able to allow you to move on this thing and then that thing, depending on the temperature and the energy, then what you're doing is not only just showing up for each other so that they show up for you, but you're actually building that decolonial formation in the city that allows for autonomous zones to happen, that allows for strikes to go on, that allows for the police to retreat, that allows for the government to be concerned. That for me is one of, and for us has been critical. And now this is just a personal thing. You know, my dad was raised a mechanic, and you know, he finished 4th grade and my mom finished high school. So I was one of the first in our family to go to college and so forth. In growing up in Palestine during the first uprising, my dad, you know, he was always telling me, I mean, why are you going out? You're throwing rocks, you may get killed. If you don't get killed, you're gonna end up protecting these settlements. Our leaders don't care about us. And I always thought he was, you know, he didn't know any better. But then you saw Oslo and what it produced, and you saw how the settlements increased, and you saw how now the Palestinian Authority protects the settlers and the settlements, and they have superhighways, and we're living in the equivalent of, you know, ghettoized neighborhoods. being raided every night, similar to many other people and different, oppressed people. So in 2011, when he came here, he was dying of pancreatic cancer, misdiagnosed in Ramallah, because people think that the occupation has to shoot you. But the way occupation, that slow death, the way in which you need a permit to get a good doctor, though you don't have healthcare, to me, the occupation killed my father that way by being raised under occupation. The point is that we got rid of all our, savings, brought him over here. And when we brought him over here, it was during Occupy Wall Street and we were all in the park, similar to Tahrir Square or whatever. And he was looking around and he's like, Amin, this makes sense. And he just finished 4th grade, but what he understood is that in the heart of empire, it amplifies everything. And so we not only are oppressed people here or in Palestine, but you can fight for Palestine where you are, depending on what your strategy is for collective liberation. And this is what power fears. This is just kind of an image where you saw the banner fall on the Manhattan Bridge. There was a decoy march, a sea of flags on the Brooklyn Bridge. And that's why the police didn't know what was going on. But this brochure was created because in 2016, remember I said under the university, under the museum, under the city, the land. So these locations become sites of struggle. It's not about the museum necessarily. Museums, institutions are a reflection of society, but they crystallize the relationships of domination in which we can both act effectively against and create spaces of transformation. So in the context of the Brooklyn Museum, they had a show that was normalizing the occupation, that was dehumanizing the Palestinians in the name of humanism. They had paid 12 photographers to go to Palestine and take images of landscapes, not political, they would say, and they put them on the 4th floor of their exhibition hall, right across from another show called Agitprop, where they're celebrating all sorts of struggles and artists. And what we did was we took action, but this was the first time, this was in 2016, where we were mature enough in the way we were thinking, first in standing with Black liberation here, and what does that mean to be in solidarity as a Palestinian group, but also as a group thinking about decolonization and abolition. We recognized that it was really important to not, if you're going to talk about settler colonization in Palestine, then you have to find a way to talk about settler colonization where you are, in this context, in Brooklyn. And how we did that was we did organizing. We went to communities around the museum that were complaining of gentrification, that were organizing against them, that had grievances, that had demands, and we thought of how we could amplify their demands and how we can work together. We ended up deoccupying the museum and putting pressure, and the Brooklyn Museum remains an open file for us. We're not tools for whitewashing occupation, dump the fine art of gentrification, settler colonialism out of Brooklyn. They have not acknowledged that they're on unceded territory of the Lenape, nor have they acknowledged that they have displaced also Mohawk iron workers in the same neighborhood over time. But also thinking about how, in acting against an institution, you can both enact this idea of a decolonial formation and decolonial solidarity and the construction of a we that understands how we are connected and how our liberation is either collective or non-existent. And so on the left-hand side, you think, a territorial acknowledgement that has material effect beyond simply representation, thinking about, decentering whiteness, thinking about a decolonial inventory of colonial era objects, many imperial plunders that they have. Again, similar to what Israel has, similar to what every colonizer has, similar to what the French have, the Belgian, you name it. So this becomes really important in thinking about how the modes in which we can resist and build together. I don't want to take a lot of time because I want to leave it for the conversation. But here's a wall, for example, where we were given, we were offered an exhibition and we said, no, we're not going to do an exhibition, but you can give us the space and give us the funding and we will create our own programming, thinking of a movement commons, ways in which we can build our power as people and create art, movement generated art that is accountable to each other and not to the market. Taking action against institutions that normalize, Israeli occupation. There's a group called Art Is in Manhattan that takes, well-respected curators to Israel and shows them, Israeli art and the Israeli state and all of this stuff. And how can, using that gallery as a base to then take direct action. Thinking of, solidarity campaigns with organizing happening in Palestine. And so this was something that lasted for 40 days. Examples of what was done around the city. Again, trying to bring these struggles together. This does not make us weak, it makes us stronger. This brings us lastly to something we can talk about more during the talk. But the Whitney Museum, one of the most progressive institutions, right, had someone named Warren Kanders who owns Safari Land, which creates tear gas, certain types of bullets that are used on the border with Gaza. And the workers at the museum organized, saying that, once they found out that that same tear gas was used in Tijuana, Mexico against migrants who are coming from Honduras, they said, we just don't feel safe. We don't feel comfortable. We don't want to be part of an institution that does this. And we organized in solidarity with them, but also over a long period of time, 9 weeks, where we deoccupied the museum without permission, taking it over with different groups over time and thinking about from tear gas to decolonization. And here's an example of like a speak out that happened on one of the floors, again, forcing our way in, making Palestine visible, but Palestine not alone, Palestine with other struggles, right? This is in their hall. People, that work with Kashmir came out, the students came out, workers came out, the Somali contingent came out. Lauda and SJP New York came out within our lifetime. These are some of the posters that were created. Again, the same tear gas was used in Puerto Rico. Again, another example is tear gas, which kind of inhibits our breathing, that is used as a way to not kill you, but stop you from resisting, is that wound that brings us together. Then how do we organize? And these are some of the images that happened. And then, with Black liberation, bringing the liberation train, something that was done in the 60s and 70s, Robin Kelly wrote about it. And taking it from the end of the train all the way to the Whitney, and all these different groups on the map on the left joining at different stops, right? So connecting our struggles, not in a just intellectual way, but in a way on the ground. Dropping banners. In the end, Kanders did go. He resigned, and that was a win. This was the march. that led at the last week that showed up to his house, right? We knew where he is, so we went to his house. And one thing so again, the escalation of our tactics as a way to build power, learn, map with our bodies, and of course, BDS always, but not just BDS, and we need to show up for others. So, to the extent that there are artists listening to this, we think of the artist as organizer, research and theory, action and aesthetics, debriefing and analysis. This entire dialectical process is the art practice. And then I'll just leave you with two things. This is a magazine that does from the Palestinian position, solidarity and connections with Black liberation and indigenous struggle. And I think this is available for download at the showroom if you go to the booth, but also on our website, Decolonize This Place. And to give you, this is at the scale in which we are operating at, 10,000 copies, distributing for free, something that's beautiful. That's it.
Amin, thank you. Kehlani, thank you both. Thanks to both of you for really incredible, rich presentations and a lot of interface as well. Really interesting. I think we are over time, and I've asked for another 15 minutes, which I think is going to be okay. So I would like to just go straight to audience questions since we don't have that much time, if that's okay. So in particular, this one question that I thought was interesting and worth discussing. So Danya Cato asks and says, thank you for hosting this wonderful conversation. My question to the panelists, how do you measure the success of our work, re-BDS and decolonization? Amin, Kehlani, no takers?
I think Kehlani should go.
Kehlani, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I think I understand the question, but I guess it depends on success around what part or what level, right? So in the service of what in particular, I'd want to kind of think about it in more specific terms. Right after the ASA boycott resolution is just one example passed, there were people who snidely referred to it as the new cause de célèbre at the same time that, those of us on the National Council were getting death threats and getting hate mail at the volume of like over 900 pieces a day. So, I thought, well, that's interesting because we're getting quite the backlash, but in the end, I think it became untenable for people to have to muster a coherent argument against something so minor within the association that wasn't binding or asking anything of any individual members. It was an institutional resolution that basically said that the association itself would not partner up with any Israeli institution. And yet it was so threatening nationally, I think, in a way that say there wasn't the same amount of backlash against the Association for Asian American Studies. And some people speculated that that had to do with the degradation of ethnic studies overall, but also the kind of the symbolics of the name of the association, of the American Studies Association, and the numbers that we have in the association. But in terms of traction, again, I'll use one more example for academic boycott, which again, some people have relegated to say that it's merely symbolic, which I think is really kind of missing the whole point, right? Because so much of it, I think of any kind of non-product boycott that doesn't have necessarily an economic piece, I see that as part of anti-normalization work. So I think to talk about it in terms of the symbolic, to try and reduce it also misses the point of what symbolic politics can do. But I do think that there is something about the fact that in the end, these campaigns, when they're not about a particular artist, trying to stop a particular artist like Kamasi Washington from going to play 48 Israel, no matter how hard people worked on that, he still went and would not speak about it. But I think part of that anti-normalization work of people bowing out is really important. And I also think that regardless of what happens in the end, even if an artist decides to go, or even if a resolution fails, like it did at the American Anthropological Association, it's the educational work that people do to mobilize that I think really changes the cultural politics of what it means to even have the conversation. And that's what I really appreciate too about the kind of work you and Natasha are doing, I mean, right, in terms of broadening and making the connections in real terms, but also literally opening up spaces where people are going en masse to actually talk and do so, engage in social criticism, but also in terms of the mobilization itself and the education itself. It's like, so there's a resolution. I feel like there's so much work that went on in the context of the American Anthropological Association, so the resolution lost for 39 votes. That, that's a drag, but it's really, the resolution is the pivot point that so much other kinds of work can happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's what often gets lost in these conversations is that, and also, this is the point around Zionism that I hope, we can kind of think through is, people can't muster a coherent argument in defense of it. And that's why they have to go with the personal attacks. And I think that that's really what people who are supportive around Palestinian people, historic reclamation and decolonization of historic Palestine is, especially in the US context, we're still not allowed to talk about Zionism. And I think that that's really, that it has to be cast in terms of nonviolent resistance or equal rights or every ethnicity and religion. But why can't we actually talk about how destructive the political ideology of Jewish Zionism is and how destructive the theological and political ideology of Christian Zionism is? So, I mean, how we evaluate successes, I think, really depends on what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I agree. And I think that, one of the ways that we measure success is the spaces in which we can open up small, medium, large for a certain amount of time that allows people to see each other and that allows not everyone, right, but the people that you want to see, right, as a way of growing together. And again, I think the idea of refusal is critical to liberation. Refusal isn't just a negation. Refusal is both a negation and an affirmation. It's a no that, the Zapatistas say that it's a no that opens up a million yeses, right? And I think that the part of what's happening right now is that we have to stop thinking that the logic that's offered to us is the only way forward. And this is where I think, there's a war waging in the imagination. And this is where art and culture and, it's about shutting the bridge, but it's not just about shutting the bridge. If you're always engaged against cops and you're not producing a different narrative, right, then you're not opening up different spaces. And we need to operate on all sorts of different spaces. It's also weird to imagine that bringing people on one platform is the end result. I think conversations around BDS are really important. Some people do it for human rights, other people, they do it for other reasons. And people that say no have to take that ethical position and live with it. And I don't think that things are stagnant that way. So there's also a lesson that we're learning, and I think that we're seeing more people in the United States, or at least in New York City, learning. I mean, you can't talk about wanting to get free and want to have a better life and not willing to risk shit, right? And people, white people, other people, it's like, are they, they want things to be better, but they're not willing to risk shit. And I think that, you know, when you take a position in solidarity with Palestine, you are risking something. I know that when we were at Artist Space, everyone was happy with Black liberation. Everyone was like, yay, land acknowledgement. But talk about Palestine, and it's as if you just talked about the worst fucking thing ever. So in a way, it's like it helps you know, it's the litmus test. It's a fucking compass. And now on our end as a Palestinian, I can't be talking about Palestine if I'm not over here fighting and throwing down for the same thing, because otherwise it's the same exceptionalism that I'll be reproducing. And who wants to live in that?
Mhm.
It's not like you can go back in time and things were rosy, you know? And I think that part of how we win is the recognition that our consent every day to shit upholds it. And simultaneously, that agency, though minimal, if you choose to withdraw it, it opens up all sorts of possibility and change the math. Palestinians during the first uprising were able to do that, right? Because why? Because throwing rocks against bullets didn't stop them. And when Rabin said, I'll break their elbows, it didn't stop them. And when they arrested me, for example, and then they said, your parents need to pay $2,000 to get you out when you're 14 years old. And he said, no. So there's something there about the logic of colonialism that needs to be broken.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm reminded about something you often say at some of the meetings that I come to, which is the question in front of us is always, how do we move, right? And so there's no single way of moving. There's no single movement that we're going to make. And so it's always about generating these multiple possibilities. And again, thinking through ways forward that we haven't thought through before. One of the interesting things about the boycott resolutions is, for example, the Right to Education group at Berzait didn't really care if the MLA passed a boycott resolution or not, right? So it kind of speaks to Kehlani's point about having the conversations is a form of movement itself, regardless of what happens with these resolutions, which have largely subsided in terms of the academic organizations, right? Each organization kind of went through something around it. We have 4 minutes. I'm gonna pull one more question from here. This is from Yusuf Kanfar. Many independent writers, artists, and the alike want to speak up, but they fear the new laws that it is illegal to criticize Israel or Zionism. Can you clarify what writers, artists can do without breaking the law?
I think Andrew or you or Kalani can speak better to that. So I'm just saying that.
In terms of the illegality?
Well, I think one thing is just to talk about these lawsuits, for example, which, as Kehlani explained, have nothing to do with whether something illegal has been done or not. So you can do something that's not illegal and it doesn't matter in terms of these lawfare situations. But the other thing I just wanted to mention is that Kenneth Marcus, who was the head of the Brandeis Center, or the director, and then became the civil rights officer for the Department of Education, and now has returned to the Brandeis Center in some capacity, I'm not exactly sure what, started using Title VI to target, Title VI legislation to target campuses. So not only do we have individuals being targeted, but we also have campuses being targeted. And with this new definition of anti-Semitism as any critique of Israel, I think we're gonna see more and more of that happening. So one thing we have to acknowledge is that this chilling effect is happening because it is shutting down conversations. And so how do we keep moving through the kinds of blockages and the kinds of fears that this questioner just brought up as well?
Right. I think it's really important to continue to speak out. I mean, this political speech itself, at least in the US, right, in theory is not illegal at all. And I think part of the the way that these lawsuits are intended is to shut us down and shut us up or make us fearful to continue speaking out. Just as a side note, Kenneth Marcus, who founded, wasn't just the director, he founded the Brandeis Center. When he returned to the center in August, he now serves as chairman of the board, which is a newly established position they created just for him so he could return.
Can I just mention the example of the recent flap over Zoom censorship of the Leila Khaled webinars? Zoom was very easily persuaded by Israeli lobby groups that they were running the risk of being prosecuted under US anti-terrorism laws. And obviously there was some heavy artillery brought to bear upon them, you know, by people speaking legal language to them. There was absolutely no basis in fact or law for that allegation, none whatsoever. But the campaign that was mounted was done in a very, you know, within a legal framework that was designed to persuade and intimidate a corporation like Zoom. And I think it's a very good example of how everything gets framed that way now in terms of a legal threat and liability and so on and so forth. And as we all know, at the campuses at which we teach, university presidents are always running scared, and they operate on the basis of avoiding liability and take counsel from their lawyers accordingly. So it is unfortunate, but you know, so much of the struggle then moves on to that pseudo legal terrain that you've been describing so well, Keilani.
We are way past time, and the organizers are asking us to wrap up. So I think unless there's any last comments, I think we should conclude for this evening. Thank you so much, Keilani and Amin, for your amazing work and your presentations. Andrew, thank you for organizing this panel. And thanks to all of you for coming.
Thanks, Jasbir.
Thank you.